Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
And, my name is Michael Lazar. Obviously, we all know each other, but thank you for being here this afternoon. We're getting ready to hear, I guess, the conclusion of our treatment capacity mapping today, something that we've all been waiting for. And what we hope to hear today is our strengths and weaknesses in our community as we continue to work on our local mental health opioid issue. We have with us today Jack, and thank you for being with us today, Jack, and look forward to hearing what the conclusions are. We understand there was a workshop this morning that included all the community partners, and it was a very good session. And so hopefully this evening or this afternoon we'll hear what the recommendations are that will allow us to get to the next, I guess, to really truly understand where our strengths and weaknesses are, our gaps, so that we can continue to work towards fulfilling those as we hope to help our community get to a better place. So, Jack, without any further ado, please come up and lead us off.
Good.
Thank you
very
again.
much. I appreciate
you
it.
being here.
Yep. No, thank you for allowing us to be here. Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jack Charlier, and I'll introduce myself and my colleague Hope in a second. I just want to first recognize the members of the Onslow County Board who are here. So thank you for the support for making this happen. Obviously, the Jacksonville City Council members, so thank you for that. And I know we've got the city manager here and Onslow Memorial Hospital, and then also, of course, Chief Yanero and his leadership, which has really made a big difference all along through the 6 months of this project. Let me get going. What we're going to do, first of all, is just give you a very short version of the presentation of the findings from the work that we've done here. And I say short compared to what we did this morning, which bordered on 3+ hours. Great conversation, a lot of excitement, but you probably don't want that full thing. So we're going to give you a short version of it. You do have in front of you, obviously, the slide deck, which again is a short version, but you have the full report available to you, and that's available in PDF if you want an electronic version of it also. But again, thank you for allowing us to be here. It is a pleasure, and I'll put up, there we go, put up my name, and then my colleague Hope, who will come up in a second and introduce yourself. We are with the Center for Health and Justice, part of TASC. So here in North Carolina, you have TASC. We're kind of the sisters and brothers from Illinois of TASC. And we do national and international work helping vulnerable populations. So we think of folks who have substance use disorder, mental health, trauma, homelessness, men, women, children, connect with the treatment and services they need so that the hospital, ER or ED, the justice system, and kind of other places that folks like that otherwise, when they have nowhere else to turn land to when they're in a real bad spot, that they don't keep going there. And so we talk about building just healthy and safe communities, because when people are well, what we do when we're well is we don't do the things that get us kind of into those other places, right? And so that's the work that we do at TASC. And again, pleasure to be here in Jacksonville, Onslow County, and in North Carolina, which is one of only 2 states that also has a statewide large TASC entity. All right, so go ahead and get started. I'm going to ask Hope to come up and speak briefly on the scope of the problem. We'll get through just a few slides, and then the rest of the time is designed for you to ask us questions, have some conversation amongst yourselves, and then let us be kind of experts on your conversation on what you need to do, so that when you leave here today, just like this morning, you have a real good understanding not of what you need to do, because that's already there, of where the next step lies, which we've outlined in the report, and you can keep moving on that. So, Hope?
Thank you, Jack. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, sorry. I want to reference now the report you have in front of you, specifically the problem statement on page 1 in the executive summary, and the background statement on page 2. We're going to look at this briefly because, as Jack said, he's going to be going over the findings in more detail later on. So TASC Center for Health and Justice was invited by the Onslow County Jacksonville Substance Use and Mental Health Task Force to map the substance use treatment available to people with opioid use disorder who will be leaving the Dix Crisis Intervention Center. Our presentation and report provide an overview of the existing community-based treatment capacity available to move people from what we call the back door or release and discharge to the next door or treatment. As you all know, the opioid crisis has had a tremendous impact on Jacksonville and Onslow County. In Jacksonville alone, in 2016, police spent approximately 16,000 hours responding to mental health calls, a cost of $1 million to the city. And in the same year, the police spent 6,000 hours responding to opioid calls. Collectively, that equals 11 full-time officers dedicated to behavioral health calls. Recent data from the Onslow County Community Paramedics shows that between January 1st and April 29th of this year, there were 83 overdoses in the county, including 8 fatalities, and half of these overdoses occurred in Jacksonville. Both the severity and urgency of the opioid crisis demand quick and streamlined access to treatment for people with substance use disorders. Officers that come into contact with people need to have options available for diverting people to treatment. Our treatment capacity map includes information provided by 28 treatment, service, government, and community agencies. This presentation in our report summarizes the current availability of substance use treatment in the county. Turn it back over to you, Jack.
All right, we're going to go into the scope of work, knowing that not everybody here was able to be here the first time that we came through. We just wanted to cover briefly what our scope of work was. You can see it on the screen. I have a tendency not to read slides. I may deviate from that to kind of highlight a few things, but you can see it on the screen. The main thing is this focus on what we call the back door to the next door. So specifically on the Dix Crisis Center, we're talking about making sure that the great investment that you as elected and appointed officials and county leaders and civic leaders have made in getting the crisis center almost up and running, right? It's all, we're just waiting a week or two more, that investment to get that person there is not lost when they go out the back door. And so what we find is that if you look at the research, getting into the brick and mortar building is one thing, whatever that might be, in this case the crisis center, but it's when they discharge out the back door, or you could say discharge out the hospital, or discharge out of the treatment facility, and the gap until they connect again with the next building, right? So from the crisis center to the outpatient, for example, from the outpatient to wherever they're going next. That gap in time is called the back door, next door connection, and that's where we begin to lose people. Why? Because we focus on the building and not the gap. And we say, oh, well, that's just a few days or a couple weeks. For folks who are severely are diagnosed under DSM-5, severe for substance use disorder, that gap measured in hours and even days can be the critical difference, sometimes between survival, right, life and death, but very often going back fairly quickly to drug-seeking behavior because their mind is not yet fully clear, even though they are cleared medically, which just means you're breathing, you're alive, and you're well, but we have to get you into recovery. So that's why when you see on the scope of work, it really does focus on this back door, next door, and that you'll see that in the report. You've got the deliverables up there for you to look at, and of course today takes us through the end of the Phase 2 convening and the report out to the council and to the board and other members who are here today. When we talk about the work that we were asked to do, this is what we do and have done for quite a while. It's done in 3 phases. So phase 1 is kind of what we call the bean counting. We come in and we look at all that your community has. I have to tell you that it is very normal for folks to focus on, when we are done with the bean counting, let's get more beans on the table to count. But as I just said, the real work of treatment capacity first begins with best utilizing all the beans that you've counted, right? And so what we often find is that communities that say we don't have enough treatment, yeah, ideally, if everybody who needed treatment came all at once, you don't have enough treatment. Nobody does in the 3,200 counties. But what you do have, and we'll show you one of the slides that shows the results of that, you have unused treatment capacity in your treatment system. That doesn't mean everything's rosy. That doesn't mean that there should not be an more investment in treatment. Absolutely not. But the first step is to get that back door, next door gap closed down so that the treatment that you do have is best used. And you'll see that when we show you one of the slides. So moving from phase 1, which is again the bean counting of how do we really take a good look at what you have available, to phase 2, which is how do we then move from intermediate solutions to best use the capacity we have while then we are building out our future capacity, right? Because again, everywhere, all 3,200 counties in the United States can all use more treatment, whether it's substance use, mental health, whatever it may be. There's not a single county that says we don't. But that's generally a longer run thing, right? 6 months, a year, a couple years to get. But in the meantime, folks who need access to the treatment, as well as your treatment system, can often handle more because folks are missing it, right? They don't know where to go, they don't know how to access it, or it's being used incorrectly. Someone goes into residential when they really need just outpatient, or someone's in intensive outpatient when they need a partial hospitalization program. And that mismatch also is a misuse of resources that makes it look like we don't have enough. And then finally, phase 3, and this phase 3 is not part of our current work, is really focused on, okay, how do we get to that longer run proposition? An example of that, of course, is the Dix Crisis Center and the leadership that it took to bring that into life. Took several years. That's kind of a phase 3 thing. Now, I understand that took 4 years, give or take. And not everything takes 4 years, but that's an example of it. If all we did was come in, do the bean counting of phase 1, then talk about where you could be under phase 2 and say, okay, in 4 years you'll have your next thing, you probably would not be very satisfied. And again, the good news is if we focus on that back door, next door, filling that gap, for the treatment capacity you do have, you can begin to see in the short run the ability to connect folks coming out the back door of the Dix Crisis Center very quickly. We talked about that this morning, and we saw how already with what you have in place, you can begin to do some of that, kind of cobble together very quickly, right? In a matter of weeks, you could have something up and running. It won't last a distance. It won't last for 2 years, but you have enough to get something going. So that first person who walks out will be met by someone at the back door right away. It's really the front door, because they go in the front and back door, but the back door of the Dix Crisis Center, who says, Jack, great job, congratulations on completing this first step. Let's walk over here now. We've got a vehicle waiting, and we're going to go take you right to treatment right now. And then from there, and we're going to hop in the car, and then we're going to take you home. And tomorrow morning, I'm going to come and see you. For folks who are in that crisis mode, that level of contact and that level of touch is what's needed. Do they need that for the whole journey into recovery? No, they don't, obviously. Think about your own experiences with medical care. Right after the procedure or the event is kind of when you need the most attention, and then that tapers off. So before I get into the summary findings, and again, you have the full report. We're not going to give that to you. Obviously, it's just a summary. I do want to acknowledge that there's been a lot of success here, and that is worth celebrating. The success, for example, of the Dix Crisis Center in and of itself coming into being and opening up here very shortly. The success of the leadership that we have seen, political, appointed, civic, organizational leadership, agency, nonprofit, volunteer, has been outstanding. And we get to work across the country. It is not like this everywhere. I have no problem saying that. It's very simple. So I'll celebrate the successes you have. And don't worry, this is not a prelude to, here's your findings, everything's bad. It's not that. I'm not setting you up for that. But I do want to make sure that that is part of what you hear from us. There's a lot of good stuff going on. We want to talk about then where you go next and what does that game plan look like. So here's the summary of findings. Again, the report goes into more details. Number one is underlined because this really is, as we looked at what you have going, where you need to focus your efforts. And that is this connection, again, back door, next door. I know I'm repeating that because that is the place where in the very short run, matter of weeks, maybe a couple months, you could already put something in place that allows you to have folks coming out of the Dix Crisis Center. And I should say generally, you could build it to have them coming out of the ED, out of a treatment facility, a overdose that occurs on a street where they decline medical treatment and someone goes out right away for them, and you have some elements of that through your community paramedics and QRT team. And you could also build this all the way up, right, for your 2300 IVC, right, so the involuntary confinement population. You could build it all the way up to that and get at the big picture. But for now, we're just thinking of the crisis center, but the same kind of build that's needed for that is the same build that could be used for the 2,300 IVC cases that Onslow County sees in a year. So the first finding is what that's about. The second finding that you see on there says that, in fact, there's already some organizations that are doing some parts of this, but it's not coordinated, which is not unusual. It's not coordinated, and it doesn't fill kind of the full range of what's called, when I say back door, next door, there's another term for it called warm handoff, where someone is moved, when I say moved, is joined in those first few minutes, hours, days, weeks, and even months of their journey through kind of the treatment system and all the things that go with it, which include going back possibly to the crisis center, back to the ED, possibly again having justice contact. But each time they come through, it gets a little better, it gets a little easier, and they have a person guiding them and walking with them along that path. For all of us who work in kind of the system, we know our processes, we know our forms, we know how to make that go. We know the hours when things are open. For people coming through this, not only might they not know that, they might have apprehension about it, they might have concerns about it, they've gone through it a few times, they might know it actually better than others do it, but it's difficult for them to go through because often folks are Obviously, their addiction is on board, and if that's present, that's making it difficult to think correctly. They might have a co-occurring mental health issue that makes it difficult to kind of function. Their family and friends might have dropped away. So the need for kind of this assistance, to have a person walk alongside them, is really, by the research, what increases the likelihood that they will not come back and or engage with treatment and or be successful in a shorter amount of time and or be successful for a longer amount of time. Does that make sense? So those are the things that we see when we do what we are proposing that you do, and again, that you have some organizations doing. Recommendation or summary of findings on 3.4 just tell you you've got some treatment capacity on board, that's number 3, and you've got some stuff that you do not have. And that's fine, because every county in the United States has that. Because this is a military community and I'm a veteran, so I'm very respectful of the fact that a large part of your population here active, retired, and also their families, dependents. We wanted to at least include in the report what we found on that. Of course, this applies not to the civilian population, again, dependents to some degree, depending on what it is, but we wanted to include that. They're not part of your response system because only active duty folks can, of course, as you guys know, access what's on here. The interesting thing to note, of course, is that they've got just about everything on board. So if you had to design what a system would look like, what DoD provides for its service members, which is good, is lots of the stuff that we talk about. Okay, so here are the priorities from Phase 2, and again, this is just a summary. The report, as I said, lays it out more. So these are your priorities. We have just one up here because we wanted to make sure that this morning's session we gave the folks in your community a chance to say, well, what else is it that we see? And so because of the energy in the room, we started on item number 1 up there that you see. We'll talk about that in a second before we get to the Q&A and whatever else you'd like to put on the table. But then on number 2, we let the folks in the room decide. And what they talked about is the urgency and the need to get the 23-hour facility up and running. And what would that look like? The reason that's important is because the 23-hour facility represents another level in what's called the continuum of care, right? So the idea that the emergency room, absent anything else, handles everything from slivers to car accidents, right? And so that's not a good place it's a good place for car accidents. It's not a good place if you get a sliver in your finger. And so what would that look like? Where should I go? And so the crisis center then, if you will, is a deflection or a diversion point from jail, from the ER and ED, and it does it at a lower cost, and when done correctly, gets the same or better outcomes. So why not use that? The 23-hour facility fits into that mode, in that for some folks, especially when we're talking the 2,300 IVC cases you have, for some folks, that 23-hour facility will be the better place for them to go. Will the crisis center work? Sure. Would it be an overuse of resources? Probably, but here's the thing, that has only 16 bed slots, right? And so you're not going to fill up, your IVCs would fill that up quickly when some of the folks through a triage process would in fact do totally fine and just as well in a 23-hour facility. So when you think again about the step down in medical care and behavioral health and all sorts of periods of life, it's what does Jack need and where do I fit specifically in the continuum? And so again, I want to commend you again because the crisis center is one of the steps in building out that continuum. The treatment you have on board is another part of it, right? I don't need outpatient or intensive outpatient, I just need outpatient. Well, then don't send me to intensive outpatient because I'm taking up essentially a chair from someone else who needs that. So the 23-hour facility was what they came up with and what we spent about half an hour on, kind of getting down the road of what could it look like to piece some of that together so you could get something going on the shorter run before that whole thing's up and running. But what we spent our time talking about mostly was number 1, and just a few more slides, and then we are done. And we'll take questions. So this is, again, the focus on the back door to the next door, and when we talk about that, of course, we mean next doors. In other words, there's lots of places that you can go. The Dix Crisis Center has, again, been over there. Really, you go in the front door and out the front door, so when we mean back door, I mean it's kind of when you're discharged, right? And so that's what we're looking at. What are some of the next doors? You see some of them up here on the screen, and again, you are familiar with what your system looks like. Notice we have the 23-hour facility up here, and this connection point to all the next doors that a person might have. So from the ED, they might go to the crisis center, right? And then crisis center, they might go to intensive outpatient. Intensive outpatient, they might eventually go to OP. I'm being kind of fairly linear here. And then they might go to a support group. Every one of those gaps, remember, is a next door, and that means it's a place where the person could say, their brain tells them, it's time to use again. this is getting too tough for me, I really want to do it, but it's time to use again. And having that person walk alongside them is what, by the research, mitigates that and says, hey, let's go talk, Jack, let's have a conversation, or what's going on? I have a rough day today, I got 3 more days till my next appointment. Good, let's go sit down and have a Diet Coke somewhere, that's my drink, have a Diet Coke, and let's talk about it. Or let's get together with your brother, I know that he's in the next town over, let's go have a conversation with him. All those things that go with it are what we're talking about. When we talk about time to treat, so I talk about this gap and what does it look like. Sometimes that may be measured in a day or two, sometime in weeks. What we talk about is when do you actually start treatment. So what the research generally looks at is not when you're referred somewhere, but when do you start your actual first treatment session. And so we're just doing this to kind of be clear on what we mean by time to treatment. Doesn't mean when you get the letter saying, or the phone call, hey, you can go to this treatment facility, they're ready for you in 2 weeks. That begins the time to treatment. That's not treatment. Or you go in there and you get an assessment, or you have to come back and turn in your ID or show proof of whatever. That's not treatment. Treatment is I sit down, I'm in my first group, and I'm with a counselor, and I'm beginning evidence-based treatment. Okay. All right, give you an example of what we're referring to when we talk about capacity by itself. This is what we call the treatment capacity triangle. And this is from your county, so this is real. And what you'll see here at the top node, and so this is, of course, your intensive outpatient. At the top node, what you'll see is your capacity right now and the number of slots, if you will. I call them slots that are open. Slots is just a word I use. It just means at the time at which we did this work, we found that you have 9 slots available. That means in that warm handoff stage, that back door to next door, that at any given time, you probably have some slots. And this is intensive outpatient, we did it for outpatient, we did it for residential, we did it for buprenorphine, for Vivitrol, for methadone. You've got slots available in the areas where you have capacity. That means that someone out there, but for the fact that they don't have anybody to guide them, to help them, to move them along, isn't taking advantage of that. And from the business side of things, kind of treatment capacity also has a business side of things for the treatment providers. This is a slot that's not available for them to be funded to do their work that the state and the county and the insurance companies want them to do, right? This is like an open slot. So the top node is the actual capacity. The right node as you face it, the left node as you look at it is the time to treat. And 2 business days is good, right? That's good. That means that on average, and we had a conversation with them this morning, it's about 2 days, 48 hours, not including the weekend. So Friday to Monday is more than 48 hours, but about 2 days to get into treatment. That's good. The research says you get down to 0 days, you get even better, obviously, right? If you needed treatment, and I could get you in right away, whatever it is you have will get treated better, quicker at the point at which you catch it. But 2 days is good. I should tell you that. It's not anything to kind of say, oh my gosh, we got to correct that. Yes, it'd be better to get it sooner, but 2 days is good. So we don't have it in here, but we do have all the other triangles for all the services you have available, and those obviously we went through them this morning, but they're available to you. Okay, last few slides, and we are done. As I said, our main recommendation, our finding and recommendation, is that you close this back door to next door gap that exists. And again, the crisis center is not open yet. We understand that, but right now the coordination is not there for this back door next door to be done in a warm handoff, real tight integration, and so that you work on that. And then the next thing will be the next door, from wherever somebody might go next to whatever that back door. That next door now becomes the back door to where they're going next, right? And that means using existing resources in the short run. It's not sustainable for too long, right? Maybe not a year and a half, whatever it might be, but to get some more resources on board, get some policies in place that allow that build to be sustainable. And what we're talking about is what we call neutral case management. Neutral case management means that there's someone who doesn't really have a vested interest in providing treatment to that person or kind of making money off that person. Or is seen by that person as kind of part of the system that they might not kind of be as friendly to, being able to do this case management work, right? And so when you think about that, generally what we like to say is that police departments, sheriffs generally should not be doing case management. First of all, it's not their role. Think of someone 6 months out who has no involvement with the justice system, why the police and sheriff would be part of that. This doesn't make sense. And nothing about police and sheriffs. It's the world I come from. But for some folks, that might not be the place place that they're going to think of, going to get help. Likewise, treatment facilities generally should not fill this case manager role. Why? Because there are ethical conflicts. If I am case managing a person, and they need treatment, I might be prone to say that the treatment they need is what we have to offer. And that's just kind of human nature. It's not saying anybody's acting unethically, intentionally, but what we want to do is get to a spot where whoever's case managing can work with the police, if they have police involvement, can work with the treatment, can work with the hospital, can work with the local school, can work with an employer, and without being seen as kind of partial to anybody other than the person that they're trying to successfully get into recovery. So that's what's meant by neutral case management. And again, the good news is you do have, and that's the top of this slide, folks in the community who already are doing some of this, just not holistically. They're doing it around a specific reason. So the top part, SUD, is the acronym for substance use disorder, so drug use, abuse, and addiction. You've got folks in the community already doing some of this. They're doing it because the clients they have and they're getting paid to do that, which is fine. But that can become a challenge, as I said, when they move beyond the world that they are in. And then at the bottom, you've got some folks who do it for very specific populations, some of whom will hit the crisis centers. And they may do full-on case management, but again, those are subsets of the populations. And then final two slides to show you, and we're right on time then for a good half hour, about 35-minute conversation as you see fit, is we want to talk about case management and care coordination. Obviously, we have Onslow Memorial Hospital here, so they do a little bit of this also, right? And so you have the necessary pieces, as we found this morning, to put together a more holistic, neutral case management role, because you've already got some folks, including the hospital, who are already doing some of that work. And then finally, community-based engagement. There's no way any of this happens without involving the community and the citizenry and your nonprofits and your local organizations, faith-based organizations, chambers of commerce, whatever it might be. What we did in our survey of 28 organizations in your community that we were able to contact is we wanted to make sure we highlight them, many of whom were at the first convening, were at the convening this morning, and absolutely said, I will be part of this, or we are already doing some of this. We're already doing some groups, or we're already helping drive folks around, and we are willing to, and able to meet folks somewhere and give them a ride. And we focused on transportation just because it worked for the conversation. There's obviously other things that people might need. So that's where we suggest you start. And the last thing I'll say, and then again, it is really just at the end, is wanted to make sure that you know that the point of us kind of coming back is to tell you, here's what we found from bean counting. You don't need to do that anymore. We're offering the plan forward, which is, again, this backdoor, next door focus. Focus on that as your number one priority. You as the community earlier today, and again, I respect that we have elected officials here. The folks in the first AM convening said the 23-hour facility should be our next focus, and that's fine. That's for you guys, to also decide and kind of chime in and weigh in on. But those two things alone would go a long, long way, especially the first one, to using your existing resources, building out your continuum a little bit, and they're both very doable because of the leadership and the level of collaboration and what you've already accomplished. You know success, you know the taste of it, and it's a good taste. And you've got a group of very motivated people, about 25, 30 people this morning who, to a person, said, I'm in. What do you need? I'm in. We're here to do it. Now, what does that look like? Doing a lot of treatment capacity work. It's tough conversations behind closed doors about how this actually works, but the point is you've got them, they're there, they're engaged. And so with that said, I'll say thank you and just open it up to any questions you might have, and I'll sit here respectfully as you have your conversation amongst these other two, obviously. So thank you very much for allowing us to do this brief report of findings back to you.
Could you
Yeah.
mention a few things? First,
Sure.
the phase 3, what you do for phase 3.
Uh-huh.
We contracted you to do phase 1 and phase 2.
Yep.
So what would phase 3 look like for actually those two components that you mentioned?
Yep. So phase 3 is the very, and I say this because it is, the very hard work of convening the tables of the folks who are needed, which can be a wide cut of folks who are needed to solve whatever it is. So when we talk about this back door, next door, and we began that process this morning, I'd say off the top of my head about 15 different agencies need to be at that table, and they need to be in rooms where we can, I always say, close the shades, right? Lock the door, and let's just go at it. Let's talk the truth about what it would take to do this. And so it opens up first by doing a convening of the right folks, and then getting through to an end product, which is, and I'm going to say this as, if it's paper, not a report, but something close to an MOU or an MOA, a memorandum of understanding or agreement, that outlines how someone, for example, this warm handoff, moves from the back door of the Dix Crisis Center through to, say, the next 3 doors. So if they're going to go to Port, your local IOP provider, if they're going to go to Port, under what conditions do they go there, who's responsible for it, and how does it work? And it solves it for you. We're not telling you then, oh, here's a pie in the sky. It is the actual report of how this would work. And all the folks who have been at the table would have said, yes, we're done. And so we deliver at the end of phase 3 for each one of those challenges. I won't say the word problems, each one of those challenges, a document that has been hammered out by the leadership of all those organizations and agreed to, so it's ready to go. Does that make sense? So we're not giving you like, this is a report that tells you, here's what we found, here's what we suggest you go next, now go do it. And again, I respect, that that's your call. This would be, okay, on the things you want to go do, we will give you then the signed agreement by all the parties. And when I say signed, what I mean, whatever that looks like for those agreements to say, we're in, this is how we're in, this is what we'll do specifically, down to enough detail that it's operationalized, it's able to be operationalized as soon as whoever, all the parties sign off on it and go. Does that make sense?
Yeah, before
Yep.
you leave that point.
Yeah.
The task force that was 2 county commissioners and 2 city council members, and Mr. Lazara and Mr. Thomas were on there, 2 county commissioners who were there, who were on there. The agreement we came up to create the Dix Crisis Center, part of the RFP that was sent out for the management company who is going to run the Dix Crisis Center says that they are supposed to put together a plan that actually does what you just described as phase 3. Because what we know, or let's just say similar to what you just described. What we know is that if a person goes through the 7 days at the crisis center, it's not like having an appendicitis where you walk out of the great hospital we have and 7 days later you go home and you recover.
Exactly.
What we know is that with drug addiction, like many other addictions, you have to have follow-up. So one of the things that Sherry and the county put in the contract is they have to have a program, and I believe it's May the 15th. Isn't that the day that your task force is going to be, the oversight committee for
The oversight
Dix?
committee is going to get together, yes, sir.
I think it's the 15th. And that's one of the things that we're going to be looking for is what are they going to be doing? Now, that doesn't offset the need for what you're discussing, but I want everybody to understand that's already in their contract. But what you're discussing, I think, is even a larger community effort. So, some of you have followed the Dix Crisis Center negotiations very closely. Some of you may not have. But I want you to be aware that that component is a requirement for that service provider. Is that correct?
So, yeah, so it's sort of like case management light is what's in the contract, if you will. It would include things like they're making contact with the next appointment and following up 72 hours later to make sure they kept that appointment, and transportation, if they need transportation from the crisis center home or from the crisis center to that appointment, if it's an immediate appointment. Those things are included in the contract. What we are speaking about here is a little bit more robust system that involves your case manager, if you will, meeting you at the door to go to that first appointment with you, not just dropping you at the door, or picking you up the next morning and taking you to that appointment when it happens, not immediately, which is going to be most of the time. So most of the time, Dix Crisis Center will be dropping them at their home, unless they're going to another treatment facility. Right. If they're going to a facility, they'll take them straight there. If they're going to their home, they'll take them to their home, and they'll have that appointment scheduled with them. They'll let them know when it is. They'll follow up to make sure, hopefully, they went to it. But the more touches, I think is the word we use, the more touches, the more times you have contact in those first few days to couple of weeks, the more likely you have a successful treatment outcome. And so having that, not just that trip to the first maybe appointment, but also the second appointment, or in the perfect world, maybe like a 60-day case management where you stay with them for the first couple of months and get them, into that habit and routine, and you're with them until their brain sort of recalibrates to the new, the new structure that they're going to follow. So yes, we put a lot of those things in it, much more robust than would be just in an average clinic. or crisis center, but not nearly as robust as what we're talking about here. And that was one of the things in the initial conversations about the crisis center. We knew there was a next. We didn't know what it was yet, but we knew there was a next. What do we have to have next in order? Because again, the crisis center is just that. It's that crisis. It's like triage and immediate crisis. It's very similar in scope for the mental health and substance use world to an ED, really. You come in, you get that immediate care, and then within a short period of time, 2 to 7 days, you're on to something else.
Caseworker is like responsible for transition
Yes.
outside of the
Yes.
center.
Yes.
Will this allow some form of, I guess, through this process, will it allow for some form of accountability? A couple of things, just a couple of points. As I look through your report, a lot of these have zeros on them, meaning that we don't have them
That's correct.
locally.
Yeah.
There's a lot of agencies, but I'll give you an example. I have a friend who's been dealing with alcohol abuse for years and years. Went to Port saw him the first time, had subsequent appointments, and they canceled 3 subsequent appointments over a period of 2 months. He had these appointments to go back for the follow-up. And they canceled all 3 of those because either the nurse couldn't be there, or... So I think there's got to be some sort of accountability of the resources that are here, because I don't think they're all at the level of what we think that they should be. Now, we can call them providers, and that's great, but what are they providing, and how good are they providing them? I think that's one of the things that we're missing, which we're doing at the crisis center. It's that accountability piece. How do we get these current providers to be all under that one page? So you have a good warm handoff. The guy goes to Port, he sees the first person says, hey, you got some issues and we need to set up some appointments. But then over a 2-month period, he never sees a doctor again.
Right.
With mental health, you don't have that time frame. How do we talk about those hard to talk about issues to be able to have that conduit of somebody in charge of Port to say, hey, what are you guys doing? It's not working.
Sorry.
It's okay. Am I making sense?
Yes, absolutely. And you're 100% on the money, too. That's one of the reasons we talk about this neutral case management. Jack, you jump in anytime.
Yep.
I'm not saying it correctly, but the neutral case management is that, so right now, if you go to Port, if you have any case management under your plan, Port does your case management. They also set your plan, so their case manager decides how many times you get visits, how many times you go to group, that sort of thing. So that's one of the things that I think Jack was sort of referencing, that they develop a plan for you that just by its nature is going to fit into their services. And so if I'm your neutral case manager and I work for an agency that doesn't do treatment, we just case manage you, then I'm going to work with you on who you need to see. And if your nurse cancels twice, I'm on the phone chewing them out.
And that's imperative.
And also,
Yeah.
I'm going to be keeping statistics to send to Trillium and say,
Exactly.
they're not seeing my people 70% of the time on their first visit. And Trillium then has a contract with all these providers, but they don't know what they don't know.
Right.
So unfortunately, the population we're talking about are the worst advocates for themselves because they're not in a place to advocate for
You're
themselves
absolutely-
effectively. So this case manager can do that.
And I'll follow up with the end of this is, okay, so they saw the doctor said, hey, we really believe that you need some medication, and so I'm going to call this in. Well, the guy doesn't work. Doesn't have the resources to go pick up his medication.
Right.
So there's no one there to say, hey, maybe you could apply for assistance here or go here. And these people are helpless, so what do? They do nothing.
That's right.
Well, it's- yeah.
And they go back to what they know.
That's right.
And that's the reality.
But one of the
And this
things,
is an adult, it's not a
Yeah.
child. This is a 55-year-old man. And so that's the reality of what we're dealing with. So when we talk about this external case manager, it's almost imperative. If not, you're going to have this recidivism, Because they cannot take care of themselves, and if nobody's following up or ensuring these providers are meeting the real needs of what they say they're providing,
Right.
then we're not getting anywhere.
And the neutral case manager can speak to the system, right? So I'm
That's
not
right.
here to mention any names because it doesn't matter. Whether they're working with the hospital, treatment, the crisis center, the police department, whatever, they can say, here's what happened to Jack as he interacted, and here's what I went and did. I went to the police sergeant and said, hey, here's what's going on with him. I'm here to advocate for him. Not to cover, not to, excuse things, but to advocate. The example of going to treatment. Jack was supposed to be in treatment appointment. You called him instead of this got canceled. Why did you cancel that appointment? What's going on? So they communicate across the system, they bind it together, and they offer collaboration and also reporting and accountability back to the system by saying, we're neutral, we're reporting to whoever pays us, who has no vested interest other than success of the individual. Here's what we found. And there's going to be some good things and some things that need to be
So
worked
Jack,
on.
is that an external contract, or is that a contracted service that we're talking about that we may engage in?
I'm going to let you guys, we began that conversation a little bit this morning, so I'll
Well,
let
I'm
you guys
asking the
handle
question,
that.
is that?
Yeah, there's different
is
ways
that what
to
we're
skin the
talking
cat.
about?
Yeah, there's
Yeah.
ways we can do it, sir, and some of them, it could be we could put out an RFP for a completely neutral company that doesn't do treatment to do this case management. There are some ways we could do it with systems we already have in place. One thought was that we might increase the capacity of the community paramedics team and maybe add some case managers beyond the paramedics that do the sort of social and mental health case management piece, and sort of increase the capacity through that. Again, it's a system we already have in place, so it has some potential
Yeah.
with less startup. And so that's a thought. But this was sort of a very, RI is a potential.
International.
RI has this model where they do that case management in other jurisdictions.
As a separate piece,
As
or?
a separate piece.
Yeah.
But I thought you might mention too, and I wrote some of these things down, it takes an average of 14 days to get to treatment nationwide, right?
Yeah, 14 days when you look at the research, it keeps coming back to the average person, about 14 days to get their first treatment appointment. I have no idea what 14 days is, just so you know. I don't think the researchers know. It just seems to come up a lot. But that's not ideal for this population coming out of the Dix Crisis Center because they have either overdosed or have a real long history of drug use or at high risk of overdose. So for them, don't think 14 days, think minutes and hours and days, just to interject that.
And then,
Yeah.
then you also said about 55% of the folks that come out of the crisis center will not go to their first treatment, right?
The U.S. For the general U.S. population, the best numbers we have indicate only about 45% will, or 55% of us generally will not make our first treatment appointment, which is pretty high, so it's worse than the flip of a coin.
And then-
But with the case manager, I'm sorry.
Go ahead,
No,
go
it's your
ahead,
story
go
to tell.
ahead. No, go ahead, go ahead.
Yeah, but with the case manager, what we can see, and it depends on the population, research, all the research indicates those, that first engagement and ongoing retention, which is what really matters, in addition. So the only two things that matter is how fast do I get you into treatment and how long are you engaged in treatment. Long as in how tightly are you integrated into what treatment's trying to do with you. You can see drops of 10 to 40%, drops in the good way of engagement, completion rates, reduced drug use at quicker points, and the recovery holds for longer points. Does that make sense? When you have someone walking alongside you, and they don't need to be, everybody's an individual. It's not like you have to think about, boy, we got to build this out for 10 years. There's always got to be someone standing next to Jack. No, Jack will taper down and then go back up and then taper down. It depends. It's the first, research is not quite clear because time is kind of an artificial construct, but certainly the first 12 weeks seems to come up over and over in some of the research. It's this real heavy time, and clinically, as they get reassessed and their drug use stops, their reacclimation into family and friends, you can look at kind of indicators that are better than time, their ability possibly to re-engage with work. Those are behavioral indicators that say, okay, now we can back off on this case management a little bit. So don't think time as much as what are the behavioral indicators that are showing Jack now is reduced drug use, reduced justice contact, friends is talking to him again. Those are the things that we look at, and when you do that, you can back the case management off. But it absolutely reduces the failure rate and increases the success rate. Yes?
Two things. Going back to the crisis center and the contract, when the committee looked at the RFP, one of the requirements was performance standards. And when they meet next week, the committee will formalize itself. I think we wound up calling it the OCCOC for all of the counties and so forth that are in it.
COC, okay.
But when, I'm just going to call it OCOC, when they meet, one of the things they're going to review is the performance criteria. Now, some of the performance criteria that Mr. Thomas, Mr. Lazara, Commissioner Knapp, and Price put in there, and obviously from the hospital and from the chief, was we want to see how many people are coming through the front door of the crisis center who come back.
Absolutely.
Because what that
recidivism.
tells us is,
Yeah.
number one, they're not getting what they need after they leave the crisis center.
Exactly.
The second thing in performance that they're going to have to do is show us, did they in fact set up the next handoff, and was that met? Now, what we're, again, if you think of this as a baseball game, because it's obviously baseball season, although the Stanley Cup is still going on.
I was going to say.
The, I have no idea whether the NBA is going on or not, because that's.
Hockey's almost year-round at this
That's it.
point, so you can almost always say that, yeah.
But, you know,
Yeah.
I consider the crisis center as inning one, and the handoff is inning two. What we have to do is figure out, how do you get innings 3 through 9? And that's really what you're talking about.
Exactly, that is correct, that's right
One
there.
of the things that we
Exactly.
know from dealing with people with alcohol abuse is, and I will put it in the standpoint of training for a marathon. Doing anything by yourself is difficult. It doesn't matter whether you're training for a marathon, or whether you're training for whatever, or whether you're addicted to something. Doing it by yourself is difficult. AA has been successful because you wind up with individuals pairing up with another individual who say, the two of us are going to keep each other sober. That's the basic philosophy of AA as I understand it. Fortunately, I'm not an alcoholic.
Like peer mentoring.
It's peer support. I mean, it's a bonding that says, you and I are going to make a bond that we're going to help. That's got to be part of the long term. Having
Absolutely.
a case manager who will also check up and is neutral, I think is a great idea. But I think part of the solution has got to be looking at the AA model to determine why has it been successful, because it has been, and how do we make that, because I know some AAs have now become, for lack of a better term, DAs. They're drugs anonymous. I think the point we're all making, though, is this: thinking that we are in the ninth inning of this is just simply folly. The commission and the city council are to be commended for getting the crisis center up and running.
Absolutely, yeah, agreed.
But this, again, I come back, this is not like an appendicitis. When you walk out of the hospital, you're not healed.
Right.
And so the concept of having, however we do it, setting up this follow-up program is absolutely essential.
Yep.
Is there, you talked a little while, pardon me, you talked a little while ago about the behavioral indicators, and based on what both of these gentlemen have just echoed, there is opportunity for another layer of support beyond the case management. Do you have an example of a volunteer-type model that you've seen that offers a second layer past case management that we could, unfortunately, with the population that we have, so there's a fair number of active versus veteran substance use disorder folks, could we enlist and follow a model possibly of volunteerism that would help support these folks as they're moving from the back door to the next?
Can I say something?
Yeah, absolutely, of course. I'm at your meeting.
Or have you looked at what the veterans or service member populations are doing? Like, we got NC Serves, that's kind of
Right.
doing kind of what you're saying, but still there are gaps in that.
Yeah,
As a service officer, we used to deal with people coming in the front door as service members, but then we had issues with trying to follow up with that. I think they're getting better with that because you're integrating the same systems.
Right.
So when they come into Camp Lejeune, then if somebody's going to far out there, Missouri, that you're connecting with another service officer out there. But I think one of the issues that you see with the veterans population, and you got to look at, I don't know how they're keeping track of, you know, what are people doing that are having these suicide issues? Because it's still great among the veterans population. And I know in the past, they have really had more services in place to try to prevent it, but trying to figure out what are those gaps, what creates those issues, and kind of looking at that and then trying to fill in the blanks to try to fix it. So
The other piece that I think is important is the development of a marketing and flow chart. A lot of these people just don't know where to go. We all think that they know where to go, who to call, but they really don't. And so how do we do a better job letting our public know that if you're in need, this is how it works? If you know, I just think that that is a huge gap. We assume that people know where to get help. But I venture to say that you could do a survey, and if you're in a crisis mode right now, who would you call other than 911? And probably half of them are skeptical of doing that because they don't want to get arrested.
yeah.
You know what I mean? So they don't. And 911, ER is probably the most safest place in their own mind. How do we do a better job with that as we develop these resources?
So let me connect a couple of these with one fell swoop answer. There are no silver bullets in life, as we know. There's a national organization we work with called Faces and Voices of Recovery, if you've heard of it. And they run, I think it's 126 what are called ARCOAs, which are the Association of Recovering Communities of America. And they help build community capacity for the recovery community. So it's slightly different than peers. When you hear the word peers, think a technically trained, certified person who might or might not need to be in recovery. They're not just someone who was a former drug user who now walks alongside people who are actively using drugs. That could be a real bad parent. So I'm not talking about peers. Again, technically trained, might be certified. In fact, I think North Carolina has a certification process for peers. Those people are almost always paid. You have two of them, Della and Alice, who are part of your peer paid staff network. But on the volunteer side, you talk about, generally we use the word recovery community, which are folks who volunteer their time, like you do, you know, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, whatever, and form chapters. And so there's chapters around the country, and they receive training, capacity building, organizational building, and then make themselves available like any other volunteer group to folks who are in recovery or want to get in recovery. It is not treatment. Is not treatment. Recovery, AA, NA are not treatment, but they are a support element. So to what you brought up, recovery, ARCO is who we work with and who we recommend. Again, if we were on ground here, we'd reach out to them and say they want to form a recovery community here. I know that Jacksonville, for example, does not have an ARCO chapter right now. And you'd have to find, you know, some folks to get it started. But then that gets to some of the other comments about where are the gaps in marketing. And I will say this, the best. So my background includes business background, right? Because to do treatment capacity, you have to understand business models and funding, because that's just the reality of it. Anybody who's in business, I know Mayor Pro Tem Lazar, you are, word of mouth for businesses is worth any amount of advertising dollars you want to put on it. When the recovery community is speaking to its own, like any other community that's saying, if you want to get good pizza, go here. And I want to be, you know, respectful of that. Go to this pizza place. That will drive tons of traffic. When your recovery community, which reaches into all areas of our society, people of color, men, women, children, says, you can trust this, that's your marketing campaign. So I want to kind of lift that up as, you know, a multi-pronged solution. It takes work and effort to get your recovery community up and running, to be sure, but they exist. And again, they have, I think it's 126, 123
But we do not have
active.
one here,
You do
right?
not have one that we found, and I think we would have found it at this point.
It's
Because some-
ARCOA?
ARCOA, yeah, Association of Recovery Communities of America, run by
See,
Faces and
that's the
Voices.
other point that
Yeah.
you made, is that we have, I think, one or two AA organizations locally, maybe.
We had
but we
several
don't-
churches.
Oh, yeah, you've got the building blocks, you
But-
just don't have it organized in a.
infrastructure's there.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and they're all volunteers. It's like saying, we've got folks who go out and help
But my-
children, but we don't have a
Encourage
Kiwanis
the-
club.
Encourage the
Okay.
collaboration. that's
Right, but my
Yeah.
point is, you have a lot of drug users are going to AA, and from what we understand is that AA is geared towards alcohol and not so much the drug use, even though there's some similar concepts.
Right, there's NA.
They feel there's a, now
Yeah.
there's an NA, but I don't know that we have any NAs
We do.
Yes, we
here.
do.
We do.
They meet at the
Probably.
crisis
But
center
I could
also.
see where the recovery community, which is neutral,
They're gonna
could
put
be
out
the
that word of mouth.
resource
Yeah, they're gonna
Yeah.
for
put out
these,
information.
or any of
Yeah.
them, that.
Right.
They won't do case management, because remember, these are
No,
volunteers.
not
right?
the case manager,
Yeah.
just
But
as
in
a
terms of saying-
resource,
right,
a
they
neutral
absolutely-
resource
yeah.
tool
Because
that.
they have that street credibility, so to
Right.
speak.
Well, they have word of mouth, exactly. And I will say that there's no way to look at anything regarding substance use disorder and not speak of the recovery community, because long-term recovery is recovery. It's not long-term clinical treatment, long-term crisis center, long-term ER. It's not long-term medical treatment. It's long-term recovery. And that is the recovering community of folks who have been through it and, again, have this capacity building that's done so that what they're saying and doing with other folks in recovery is not harmful but beneficial. And that's why we talk about the formation of these like I'm in the Boy Scouts, right? If I was never trained but I bought a uniform, wouldn't make me a Boy Scout, right? You know, that kind of thing. So these are folks who can do that. They won't do, again, the case management, but they definitely can come alongside that, and that's what they do. You have the basic elements here because you have folks, they've been at both convenings, we've talked to 28 of your organizations that are doing something in that space, but they're just doing it alone. Not unusual. Coordinate that, build that up, right? You do that kind of in your phase 3, and you will see kind of a robust lift across, and to your point, you'll see a marketing effort because they'll go and say, yeah, this is okay, you can trust it. You can call the police or you can go to the crisis center or whatever it might be, and that will be good. And likewise, they'll say, do not do that. That is not the way to go, brother. Let's go down here and just go the other direction. That can also happen, so, you know, be forewarned. I don't expect that to be a problem here because you got great leadership, but it can turn the other way too, you know?
Royce?
Maybe
Yeah.
I missed something. We're talking about all the long-term needs, and we all know they're long-term needs, but your slide said we need a 23-hour facility.
Yep.
How does that fit in here?
Yep.
What does that mean?
So that's part of the continuum of care, right? So we focused our work on the Dix Crisis Center, but it just so happens, right, that you have the administration building for the crisis center that also has the ability to be used for more than administration, right? You go in
That's
there
the
and it's a
front
big
building
building.
that we're in.
Yeah, it's the front part of it. And that offers yet another level of care, if you will, by which people could walk in, the police and fire and paramedics could drop someone off there to get triaged and assessed to say, you know, it might just be that being here with us for a little bit, doing some connections to community-based treatment, inducing you with MAT, again, we'll stay within the opioid realm with medication-assisted treatment, if that's clinically indicated and medically indicated, can be done here. We don't need to take one of our precious slots in the crisis center. You don't need to go to ED. But also, you don't need to be on the street because you do need this 23-hour facility. So it's kind of another level of care.
That's the front door, not the back door.
Well, so every front door is also becomes the back door because people move through
Well,
the system.
and the reason he's focusing on that is because we spent the money and the facility is literally ready to go.
It is.
Short of implementation, which we're slowly working on, I
We're
guess.
working on it.
Yeah.
But, so that's an immediate step that we could take because the facility's there and ready. And so essentially, it would give us how many more seats?
Well, so the way to think of the crisis center is.
We got
we've
16
talked
beds, but
about
up
that.
front, we talked about how many
So
seats
say you
we
did,
could potentially get.
we'll use example from this morning, say you
actually
did 10
less.
chairs, right? Now remember, it's 23 hours. Those can cycle much faster. So if everybody stayed there for 4 hours, you did that's 60 slots, if you will, in a day. People cycle through it faster because their level of care that they need is much less than a crisis center and emergency room, but higher than what an outpatient would
Could be.
clinically indicate because they first need something more. And that might be just a place to stabilize. They might have used again because something happened. No, not that they wanted, but something happened. And they used, they relapsed, or they're using for the first time and come and sit here, have some staff help them and move them along. Again, it's all this kind of continuum of care, right resources for the right person without overusing or overspending your precious tax dollars and foundation dollars and donated dollars to put Jack in a crisis center when I really just needed a kind of place to hang for a few hours, meet someone, talk with someone, and get connected with someone.
Right, and you may talk about, we got 6,000, when you look at all three counties, you know, that roughly around 6,000 IVCs last year. So if every one of those IVCs, and I know every one of them won't go there,
That's right.
but if a large portion of those, and Sam actually said that normally they keep those folks about 8 days IVCs at the hospital. When you start putting those numbers together, that facility is going to be filled up very quickly. And I think the important part to understand is that, just when you're talking about that marketing piece, I'm thinking, the first time that an officer or a citizen gets to that facility and it's full and we can't serve them, then that's going to get around. And that's the importance of that 23-hour facility, being able to provide those services for all those folks, so that as soon as an officer or an EMS worker or a citizen comes in there, they get some level of service. Because then it's going to default back to what we did. I mean, I tell the story about us going 3 times with an individual and finally taking them to the emergency room because, RHA wasn't providing those services for us. So, we had to take them to the emergency room so they're IVC, so they're kept, so they're not in a danger to themselves or others.
Yeah.
So I really think that's really the strong push to look at that 23-hour facility to make sure that we have the capacity to provide services for anyone that needs help, whether that's an urgent care, which I learned there's a difference between an urgent care for behavioral problems versus a 23-hour facility.
I think urgent care refers them right to the emergency room. I don't think they see them.
No, I'm talking about. there's
A mental health.
I got you.
It's a mental
I
health
apologize.
urgent care model, which is different than a 23-hour facility. The urgent care model can't hold IVCs, but it can provide those kinds of services. It's a different kind of model. The 23-hour, they can be IVC'd for that 23-hour, de-escalate, get the medication, and be transported back somewhere else. So,
Mike, I think one thing you might want to clarify, especially for Commissioner Bennett's question, why do we call it a 23-hour facility? There's something in the law, as I remember from our task force meetings, that you can keep that really wasn't good. You can keep a person up to a certain number of hours, but beyond that, you have to do other things. That's where the 23-hour term, what's that ruling?
Well, feeding them and providing showers, providing beds.
But I thought that there was the law that said
And
you
there-
could keep a person up to 23 hours, but after that, you had to commit them or something. Is my memory wrong?
Well, from my understanding now.
It becomes inpatient at 24 hours.
Yeah.
And there's a
Yeah, it
different
becomes
standard.
Inpatient.
I kept you
You
for more
can't
day, I better have a
provide
good reason
services.
for you to be here, and now I gotta care for you. 23 hours is technically not,
Pardon
it's
me?
not a day.
It changes, if you keep them beyond the 23 hours, it's a licensure issue.
Yeah.
So if you either have to discharge them at 23 hours, send them to another inpatient
I
facility.
can handle that.
Because if you keep them beyond it, you're now out of your licensure status.
Yeah.
Because the 23 hour doesn't require a licensure. But beyond 23 hours does, if you keep them.
Why don't you come up and join us? Would you mind? I mean, seriously, Dr. Gilbert, please come up.
See what happens when you speak up?
That's right.
Next is work assignments. Now you're at the wrong table for sure.
We're good at that.
Yeah, exactly.
But also, the facility-based crisis center isn't technically inpatient. Even though they stay overnight, it's not considered inpatient, at
Not
least in
in
the state of
the
North
treatment
Carolina.
center, that's correct,
It's,
yeah.
it's considered facility-based crisis. So it's a lower level than inpatient, but it's a higher level than the 23-hour, which doesn't require the same licensing.
Well, I wanted to respect your time. It's a little bit after 4. We were going to go 3 to 4. Are there any other things on the table? And we've left you with a report. We left you with a path forward based on that. And just
Can
what
you,
else? Yeah.
can you describe how your meeting today was in terms of your interaction with the providers? And as I said earlier, you have a lot of zeros in here of what we don't have. So
Yeah.
obviously, we've got, I guess you said 28?
Well, we
What was
spoke
the
with
number?
28 different organizations.
Organizations.
not limited to treatment
Based on
providers.
your
Yeah.
professional opinion, do you feel that with the organizations that we have, if we can corral and do some of the work that you're talking about, that this would be a much better step forward as we move into this next phase?
You mean doing the recommendation on the warm handoff?
Yeah, I mean,
Absolutely.
it's really important
Yeah.
that, we have all these people, but right now, we
Yeah.
feel like we don't have any. How do we get that together? Is that what you're recommending, is that's
That's
really
it.
the proper next step?
It is. So what we have on the screen right now is the priority was build your warm handoff, your back door, next door. What you are referencing, something we talked about right in the meeting. I said, you know, how many of you think that you don't have a lot of treatment, or were surprised to find out you didn't have a lot of treatment? A lot of hands went up. But how many of you learned that you actually have unused capacity? Not as many hands go up. Our brains focus on what we don't have, what we're missing, what we'd like to have, because that's like a good survival skill. So you actually have treatment capacity that's unused, and the recommendation is to focus on getting the back door, next door first set up, because you have unused capacity, and then work on things like the 23-hour facility, versus looking at the zeros. I think it's 5 different triangles, if you will, have zeros on them, and saying, boy, we need to build that up. It doesn't matter if there's no customer, if you will, goes to them, or they can't drive a business model. It doesn't matter. You need to have the mechanism by which to help people move along from one part of the treatment system to the other, and into recovery. Absent that, any treatment provider, mental health, substance use will tell you, I can't get people through my door because they're not functioning well enough to kind of get here on their own. And they're not stable enough, and they don't have the family support. So yes, this is where you should go.
And to me, being part of the committee and formalizing that,
Yep.
and maybe doing this contracted service that we're talking about, or service, will help us really know the quality of those entities and whether they're successful or not. To me, I think that accountability piece is so important.
Yep.
To really know, out of the 28 organizations, 5 are really good and 20 aren't, or 25 are great,
Because the money's
and
available.
3 are not.
Yeah.
You know, I think it's important to really understand what that landscape looks like.
Yeah.
For us to be able to do our work moving forward, and as we're
Yeah.
doing with the Dix Center, to know who's providing and who's not. So that if we only have 5 out of 28, then we know what we've got to do.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, and the case management is that neutral voice that offers data, accountability, collaboration
to me,
across
that's
the system.
invaluable. If we
It absolutely is.
want to curb recidivism.
Yeah,
You know, there's the old adage that when it's everybody's job, it's really nobody's job.
right.
But when it's somebody's job, it is somebody's job. The difficulty that we face is there are a lot of good agencies all trying to help. Why did NC Serve, which Ron Massey's done a great job on the city's part, why did NC Serve for the veterans get set up? Because they found that there were all kinds of veteran services, but none of them were coordinated.
Yeah,
If you really want to get into properly managing what I'm gonna call the warm handoff and the follow-up after that, then the county and the city have to get together and say, how are we gonna fund it? And whose responsibility is it gonna be? Because, you know, you can have this church over there and this church over here and the hospital and the city and everybody doing their individual things. Maybe it's overlapping, maybe there's still voids. But at the end of the day, it's like anything else. We're going to have somebody, if we are serious about not just helping them for 7 days, but truly helping them for the rest of their life, then you're going to have to set up a system very similar, and pardon the analogy, but very similar to the parole system. You have parole officers who are responsible for seeing that people who are out of, or who are still in the justice system are doing what they're supposed to be doing. You're going to have to set up a system so that people who are trying to get off of drug addiction, or I guess you're always addicted, but handle your addiction, you're going to have people who are responsible for that. And that's going to come down to money. Now, I certainly agree, those people should not be part of the police department. They should not be part of the sheriff's department. But at the end of the day,
Have to be accountable to all
somebody-
departments, okay?
well, that's right. Yeah, that's right. And I will say this, that you, again, remember, and I'm putting it up here, you do have in the report, you do have folks who already are doing some of that work, like the community paramedics, RI International of Capacity. And I will tell you, and again, I'm not preaching anything for task, but the task model is what is designed for that multi-systems accountability. So you know the model. You've got some organizations, I'm trying to find it, you have some organizations that already are doing something like it. Here they are up there. So you could expand some of that. You could, we talked about this morning, kind of cobbling together an intermediary step that could be done probably in a couple months to get something that looks like that going now. It couldn't last the distance, but while that's, you could look at that and see what that looks like and give a test run and see who does this better, and then get into it. So you have what you need, and then in the longer run, you will need money. But you can get something going here on the shorter side.
Well, I just feel if you want to be effective, there has to be some matrices, there has to be someone to
Yes.
say, hey, you guys are legit, or you guys are really
Absolutely.
not effective
Yep.
in this
That
process.
begs
That's
the
it.
question of, are we only talking about helping Onslow County residents, or are we talking about the people from Carteret County and Craven and
Well,
all
this-
over
this
that
study-
bring people to the crisis center?
So this study was for Onslow County. It wasn't, because we paid for it together, obviously, it's for Onslow County. They
So
can
what-
certainly
what-
do it for others, but these are the people that are going to be coming through our system. So I don't think we're going to be prejudiced on that.
So if somebody
Because
comes
we
out of
need
the
those
crisis
numbers.
center, you know, if somebody comes out of a crisis center, we can ask them which county they live in before we decide who's
Well,
gonna
we'll have that
look
data.
out for
And then we gotta
Well, I
understand
know.
the resources where they live, so we.
Right, and we can
Right.
provide them the handoffs
Right.
within our community. But it, well, I guess not just in our community, but if they go
Right.
externally back to their community, that data will
Yeah.
come forward to us.
Commissioner Bennett, I would almost venture to say, I will venture to say, if this study applies to Onslow County, this study applies to Carteret and Craven
sure
County,
it does.
without doing another study.
Yeah.
Research
Now,
does,
the
but-
point,
Yeah,
the
we're
point you're
talking about
raising,
how we're gonna-
yeah,
how
the
we're
point
gonna-
you're raising, though, is this: should we be trying to find case managers that only process people in Onslow County? And the answer is, yeah, you can do that. But just as we formed a great partnership to fund the Dix Crisis Center, this is a statewide issue. So if nobody else wants to participate, then I think we just worry about Onslow County people. But if you're going to put together the expense and the structure for good case management, maybe you do try to engage the other two counties.
I mean, does it really matter where they go? We might not have a 30-day facility here, so that case manager may have to refer that individual to Wilmington or to somewhere in the mountain. You know, I mean,
Yeah.
I don't think you could be exclusive to Onslow County.
No, I think what he's saying
Well, but
is,
if we're gonna
do you
get
only handle the
Case
Onslow
managers
County
gonna
people?
be,
Yeah, but
our
you can't- you can't do
EMS
that.
people are gonna be your case
Yeah, I don't
manager,
think
are
you
we gonna
can
run
do
them out
that.
to Carteret County to chase people down to see what they're doing?
And
or-
your case
You
manager,
know, we gotta
people in
have,
Onslow, I think, could connect with the other counties
Yeah, I
to
mean,
get the handoff
you
there.
could, but I mean, I think it's a start to
Just
where we
gets a
can
little-
corral and build a platform that we
Yeah.
can work from and adjust as we learn more about it. But strategically speaking, it's the right steps to truly understand.
And
Yes,
I
please.
feel like we will, if we engage with particularly Carteret and Craven and talk about this
They'll do it.
with the same group, I think they'll be
They'll do
on
it.
board on whatever level they're able to, because they're continuing with other initiatives in their own communities as well. So, you know, maybe there's the potential for us to sort of manage the process and them to have their own case manager from their county. So when their person gets out, you know, maybe they make that connection to take back to their community. But, and Mayor Pro Tem's correct, we're going to be placing people all over. Everybody's not going to get to stay local for whatever their next step is. But a lot of people will. A lot of people, you know, we talked about this from the crisis center, the vast majority will not go to long-term treatment. Some will, but the vast majority will end up back in the community at some level. And so that's a big deal, is how do we take care of those people, particularly that stay in the community, and make sure we get those next steps. If you go straight to a long-term treatment, you're good for a little while because they're going to keep you and they're going to do those things every minute of every day. But if you go home and you have to wait for that appointment, that's your time that you're in trouble.
Well, I also go back to what Mr. Lazaro said early on. When people don't know what they're supposed to do or how they get help, we apply Narcan how many times this past year, Chief? Pick a number.
I think that we could safely say that we did it 80 times in the county-wide. They did it 80 times in the last 4 months.
Well, let's just say that it's 80 times in the last 4 months. After we left the scene what did we leave that person with? We might have left them with another Narcan so they could try to apply it themselves. What Mr. Lazare is saying, I think, is we need to also provide information so that when that person gets stable, they know, okay, when you feel the urge, here are 4 different organizations or 1 door you're supposed to go to.
It will help you.
And that door may be one set of instructions for people in Onslow County, another set of instructions for Craven County, another set of instructions for Carteret County. I definitely agree with you. It's not Onslow County or the city of Jacksonville's responsibility to fund and serve the world. So we have to, as Sherry said, I think we have to engage those others. But as we build the plan, it has to be one that says, here's how we're going to handle our family. You're going to have to figure out how you handle your family. But I think that, my last statement, which probably won't be my last statement, is I think we all recognize that the things that you put in here, I think we already knew. But you've done a good job of documenting so that we now can say, hey,
This is our.
we've got to move forward, and here are some recommendations.
Yeah, and what I would say too, is, we get that, we come into communities and people say, you told us kind of what we knew. What we're also saying is, don't go focus on building your capacity, moving those zeros yet, get the connections in. So we're prioritizing for you, because the default otherwise is, we see zeros, let's go build that. No. Just first better use your resources. You need to do that
And
too. Bill, because that stuff takes longer. So I apologize for interrupting. I just wanted to, it's also the prioritization of what to do. Otherwise, we focus on zeros and say, I don't want zeros. Yeah, but in the meantime, you've got this unused capacity and people are missing the mark on how to access it. Exactly. I apologize,
Make my final statement
Yeah.
before Dr. Woodruff makes his final statement.
Yeah.
Couple of things. I know in this situation, peers are going to be very important.
Mhm.
Because I know from dealing with the veterans community, more veterans have learned from veterans than they've learned from the different organizations, the different VSOs and what have you. So that's going to be very important. So we got to figure out how to utilize those folks and how to connect them. Another issue I have is it's always, and now the emphasis is on opioids. And when you're dealing with communicating to other people, they might not think of this if they're dealing with crack or meth and if you can't get opioids, a lot of times it's heroin. So we got to figure out how to communicate. I know the military was having an issue concerning huffing, which is dealing with basically solid waste, dealing with human waste, putting in a bag and getting high off of that. So it's trying to figure out how to communicate. You're talking about opioids, but it's addiction, period. So
I
trying to
agree.
filter
Whatever
people
that
through
is.
that,
No,
yeah,
it
whatever
is.
that is.
Yeah,
So,
it is, yeah.
and then another thing is, because we deal with the military, how are we going to deal with, because we want people to come in regardless of being active service members or what, but how do we communicate that we want to help you, and it's not like we want to turn you into Camp Lejeune at the end? That's another issue I think we're going to have.
To get in trouble
Right.
issue.
Yeah, to get in trouble issue, because I know even I started learning how to identify, even though I was a psychiatrist, I would send people back when I thought PTSD was an issue. You need to go see this person, or if a TBI is the issue.
Right.
But a lot of times, they didn't want to report PTSD because a lot of our military become first responders. Or, they don't want their
Public
guns
safety,
taken away.
public
So,
safety.
some of that nature. So, I think those are some things we're going to have to figure out how to work out also.
Can I just say one thing in response to something you said too, with regard to your peer supports? It's not out of the realm to think of using your peer supports as your case managers. So they kind of fill both roles in connecting and following, and they, know the role, know the way, and that connection is there. So when we're talking about that neutral case management piece, I just envision them as great people. However however you guys choose to go forward with the neutral case management, their loyalties don't really lie per se with anybody, except for the patient or the client or the individual who's, they're trying to get into treatment, because their goal, and at least the two that we work with Della and Alice, they work really hard to get them in, the individual into treatment. And they take calls and texts all night long to work really hard to do that. So I think their loyalties lie with the individual, not with the agency.
And at the end,
And
they're
so-
successful people. too.
Yeah,
And
exactly,
all through it.
because they're case managing and they're being that peer support person. So that's just a thought with regard to your peer comment, so.
Well, that's it. We've
Jack, thank
we've
you.
given you everything we do, and we're done.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, well,
Okay,
thank
well,
you,
thank
very
you.
But you have
informative.
that structure, that's what.
Yeah. Thank you.
Took over, man. I don't disagree.